Hello, everyone, and welcome to the final part of my Alexander McQueen series. It is so lovely to have you all here. I hope everyone is doing good. I think I might be losing my voice. I have no idea why. It might be the Chicago weather, but we're going to see how this goes. That being said, if you're new here, welcome. My name is Lolly, and I make videos on fashion designers and their work. So if you like fashion and talking about fashion, or just even interested in hearing more about their lives, then this is the place for you. And I want to welcome everybody to the final part of my Alexander McQueen series. It's exciting, it's thrilling, it's bittersweet and sad all at once. But here we are. This has by far been my longest series and also my favorite. I've been waiting to talk about Alexander McQueen forever, and it means so much that I get to do that today on the platform that I created for myself that I am incredibly proud of. This video will probably be the longest in the series, and it might be the longest video I make in general, and that's because I think I might be a little over ambitious with what I'm trying to fit into today's video. So we're going to see how it goes. That being said, we're just going to jump right into it because we have a lot to talk about today. And as always, a little disclaimer, today's video is haunting, to say the least. We are going to be discussing topics including depression, drug use, suicidal tendencies, and suicide. So if those are things you just aren't up for hearing about, that's totally understandable. Do feel free to come back to this video if and when you do feel up for it. In part 1, we talked about Lee's early life and career. In part 2, we talked about Alexander McQueen's rise to fame and stardom. And in part 3, we talked about Lee's departure from Givenchy, his work under Gucci Group, and ultimately what he was feeling and battling in those final few years. And I know, I ended part 3 quite abruptly, yet again. But I'm trying to keep the story somewhat together, and hopefully this will make more sense as we start this video. So we ended part 3 discussing 2 collections, La Dame Bleue and The Girl Who Lived in the Tree, collections that kept the magic of Alexander McQueen alive, and made the public think Alexander McQueen was back and better than ever. And while his final 3 collections were nothing short of magical and meaningful, we know, as we discussed at the end of part 3, that Lee Alexander McQueen was in a downward spiral. After Isabella Blo's death, it was said Lee's drug use had only amplified, and he became obsessed with the idea of death, researching celebrity suicides and the various methods by which people have committed. And he began telling people, "As I was powerful in life, I will be a god in death, and gays don't do old." It was as though death became his obsession, and I think also his way of coping with grief, loss, and illness, because as we also talked about in part 3, Lee had been diagnosed with HIV, and there was a point where he discovered he was HIV positive. And it's unimaginable and inconceivable, to me at least, how anyone was able to live with what was considered a death sentence lingering over them. Thankfully, that's not how it is today, but it was, and I'm sure Lee felt alone, knowing the world would continue spinning, that his work would live on without him. It had to feel like there was no point. And maybe that's why his next 3 collections look toward what the future might look like for us, the destroyers of the human race.
I'm working on it. Yeah, no, it's good. But I'm working on it. I'm working on something for the future that is just constant. Sure, take fashion into the 21st century properly.
Now let's start off with the first one. Natural distinction, unnatural selection, was inspired by the Climate Change Act the UK had introduced in response to our growing climate crisis. Around the same time, the Avatar movie had just come out, which spoke to man's destruction of natural habitats. So in true McQueen fashion, Lee began exploring the threats to our own planet. The entire show was inspired by the Climate Change Act, Avatar, and Charles Darwin's research on the origins of species, the concept of which speaks to survival of the fittest and the disastrous results of industrialization on the natural world. And thus the stage for the show was Earth, filled with taxidermy stuffed animals, and every model wore Nesh netting over their face, and their hair was delicately smushed against them. And to continue on with this theme, the invites for the show were actually made by Lee's nephew, and were a hologram portrait of Lee's own skull. Natural distinction, unnatural selection was divided up into 2 segments. The beginning of the show looked at the world untouched by man. It was romantic and delicate, with organic shapes and soft colors and prints of wood and flowers. But then came the birds and the darkness, to symbolize the negative effects of 21st century evolution. This portion of the show featured flowers, crystals, and minerals with a hard edge to convey the artificial feel of modernity and the power of human touch. The silhouettes were also sharper, with structured harsh lines. But overall, the biggest triumph of the show was Lee's use of digital printing, which he began exploring in this collection, and will have perfected by the time of his passing. In his show notes, Lee said he was not aiming to preach, but his fundamental belief was that we're in danger of killing the planet through greed. And he was right. If billionaires had their way, they would get rid of us. Let's be honest, they are trying to get rid of us. It is not survival of the fittest anymore, it is survival of the richest. Anyway, at the end of the show, Lee emerged in a large bunny costume, waving to the crowd as if he was an animal in his own environment. To me, this shows Lee was doing everything he possibly could to find joy, because I do think he could have pulled himself out of the depressive state that he was in if it wasn't for his mother's worsening health. Because around this time, his mother Joyce had been diagnosed with cancer, and the outcome wasn't looking good. And this just seemed to be his final straw, because everything truly does go downhill from here. In a period of serious reflection, Lee began to look back at his legacy at Alexander McQueen. He really wanted his work to matter, to make a difference, because that company was everything to him. And it really bugged him that caring was making him collaborate with companies like Target, Samsonite, and Puma. They were focused on making his work accessible to the masses, and that didn't sit right with him. This wasn't where Lee had envisioned the house of Alexander McQueen going. He wasn't interested in mass market saturation. He didn't care about the money, if he was being sold in 1 million stores worldwide, or if he had storefronts in Tokyo and LA. His work is what mattered most to him. His work was supposed to matter to women, to protect them, and make them feel beautiful, powerful, and strong. He wanted his work to be preserved, to be handed down as heirlooms, but these watered-down price lines with Puma, Samsonite, and Target were so far from where he wanted Alexander McQueen to be, and that ate at him. So as I said, in a period of deep reflection, at odds with himself and his business, Lee had enough, saying, "This whole situation is such a cliche. The turnover in fashion is so quick and so throwaway, and the problem is there's no longevity." So Lee decided to tell everyone just what he thought about the future of fashion, in the best way he knew how, through his work. Telling the press it's important to look at death because it is a part of life. It is a sad thing, melancholy but romantic at the same time. It is the end of a cycle. Everything has to end. The cycle of life is positive because it gives room for new things.
Anger with myself, anger with the world. I won't go anywhere else and try to stop it. But everything can't reverse. It's dark.
And at just a week shy of 40, Lee created a spoof collection that was nothing short of the couture-level work McQueen was known for. The Horn of Plenty was a metaphor on excessive production and its impending disaster, a direct reflection on what was going on in his own life, as after the financial crisis of the 2000s, many designers became solely interested in money, and the odd collaborations with his own brand left Lee consciously aware that he was part of the problem. He felt there was no more risk left in fashion, so he created a satirical collection dedicated to his mother Joyce. Lee tied the collection back to his first, Jack the Ripper Stalks His Victims, using the name of the East End pub where one of Jack the Ripper's last victims was seen, the Horn of Plenty. Lee brought back the swallow print and the raven. He had hats made out of garbage bags, trash can lids, lampshades, and umbrellas. Everything about the show was exaggerated, including the models, whose lips were overdrawn in red and their faces were painted stark white. It was said to be a reference to Terry Gilliam's film Brazil, as well as a social commentary on how women did themselves up for the beauty industry, and worse, men. Lee really wanted to demonstrate how corporate greed was destroying the planet, so that's why the stage was dominated by car parts, old computers, junk TVs, and leftover props from Lee's previous shows, like the horses from What a Merry-Go-Round and the chandelier from Saraband. He even reused old pieces from his earlier collections, including the yashmak, the Turkish veil from his eye collection that Sean Lee had made from red Kobuchon Swarovski crystals. By reusing old props, accessories, and materials, Lee was alluding to the wastefulness that occurs in fashion. But this simply wasn't enough. Lee also wanted to show how fashion had run out of ideas, and designers were just reinterpreting classics rather than coming up with something new and inventive. And he decided the best way to demonstrate this message was to remake iconic outfits, including Christian Dior's new look houndstooth, Coco Chanel's tweed suits, and Hubert de Givenchy's little black dress. He was mocking couture and its boring designs, with him saying, "It's not safe in any way. It's a punked-up McQueen it-girl parody of a certain ideal, of a woman who never existed in the first place. It's Audrey Hepburn in Breakfast at Tiffany's. It's Dior. It's Valentino's Ladies Who Lunch. I want people to look like, what the hell is that?" So that is why for the show, Lee blew up Jen Plaid or Prince of Wales check and houndstooth, bigger than anyone had ever seen. The houndstooth was made famous by Christian Dior, but the original print was actually made in Scotland, and Lee purposely decided to make everything look trashed, lacquering silk and using paper nylon. With Sarah Burton saying the second look in the show used traditional houndstooth that had been lacquered. Lee cut the jacket himself. He slashed it, cut an asymmetrical kimono sleeve, and took the collar off and recut it. He laid the piece of fabric on the floor and cut it to make just the right collar shape. It was incredible. But the real showstopper was the final two looks. Symbiotic opposites, inspired by the white and black swans from Swan Lake. The white duck feather dress had an exaggerated cowl that surrounded the model's upper body, and the black duck feather dress resembled a raven, the romantic symbol of death. And as the show concluded, you could hear the sound of a heart monitor flatlining. It was hauntingly melancholic. And I know I said in part 2 that Joan is my favorite collection, but the Horn of Plenty is right there next to it. I only didn't mention it then because I was waiting to talk about the collection first, but that raven dress has haunted me for over a decade. The Horn of Plenty was ballsy and beautiful. No one is or was bold enough to go where Alexander McQueen went, and it is because he never took the work too seriously, not even for a day. He knew that it was just clothes and nothing more, that destruction was a part of life, that death was a part of life. He acknowledged that and allowed it to ebb and flow through his work. There has never been anything like it since. And you can disagree with me, if you dare. I'm kidding. Or not. Ultimately, this show gave Lee an outlet, with him saying, "I think that everyone who will revise the collection will understand that it was created at the time of the recession. We drove ourselves to a deadlock because of unrestrained disorderly consumption. I've never been this hard since I've been in London. I think it's dangerous to play it safe because you'll just get lost in the midst of a cashmere twin set. People don't want to see clothes. They want to see something that fuels the imagination." Lee was looking inward, reminiscing about how as a child he would watch from the window of his council flat the crystals circling above, and how he wished to be free just like them. And when an interviewer asked him if he felt free now, he responded, "Are you joking? It's worse now. I'm in a glass box." However, the Horn of Plenty did give Lee some perspective. After the show, he called up Simon Unglis and told him that he was ready for a change. He was fed up and burnt out with the fashion world, and Simon Unglis devised this plan for Lee to fly out to San Francisco and they could run a graduate program together at the Academy of Arts University. And it really seemed like Lee was considering this move. He talked about renegotiating his contracts, how he could provide inspiration for the shows. He would still work on menswear, but he would leave everything else to Sarah Burton. He told Simon Unglis, "I can leave it to her. She's going to do everything. I can just go in and oversee it."
What do you expect for the next years?
Well, I believe in destiny, and if my destiny still lies in fashion in the next 5 years, then that's good. If it means my destiny takes me somewhere else, maybe film or art,
But you are open,
I'm open. It's
like here.
like my life is an open
Yeah,
book.
yeah.
In England, we say I wear my heart on my sleeve. Uh, yeah, I'm at peace with myself now. It's a nice place to be because I'm under no pressure except my own pressure, but I'm always pushing myself, so it's good.
And while this seems like it was almost a moment of clarity for Lee, it was said that Simon Unglis didn't really hold Lee to his promises because he didn't know how much of their conversations was the drugs talking. And I absolutely do not mean this in a condescending way, and I don't think Simon Unglis did either. But it was said by many that by this point, those around Lee did not trust anything he had to say. He was constantly falling through on promises and not showing up when asked or needed to. It was as though drugs had taken over his life. The sadness was all consuming, and he just wasn't in the right headspace mentally, emotionally, psychologically, existentially, or even physically. There was a lot going on, so daydreaming what ifs with Simon Unglis seemed to be his only escape, his way of coping. Shortly after this conversation, Lee would take a trip to Ibiza with Sebastian Pons, but Sebastian Pons said that for most of the trip, Lee was acting paranoid.
He could hear voices. He was telling me that they were chasing him. And one thing he used to say, paranoia will destroy us.
And taking a lot of drugs, and he became worried for Lee's health because every day he was pounding on Lee's door, yelling at him and reminding him to take his HIV medications, which made Sebastian Pons feel as though Lee wasn't keeping up with his medications back home in London. And to make it even eerier, Sebastian Pons remembers one of the final conversations he had with Lee, where Lee told him,
He said to me, I designed my last collection, Sebastian. And he told me I had enough with all this. Are you going to kill myself? And what do you mean? What do you mean you're going to kill yourself? It's like, yeah, it's like I am fed up. I had it with this. I just want to put this an end. And in my last show, in the end, he said, you remember Voss? So I'm going to do the sort of same thing, but it's going to be a perspex box the size of a human being. So when the show ends, this box is going to come out from the ground with me inside, and then I'm just gonna choose myself.
Lee even told him how prepared he was, that he had his will finalized, and it left Sebastian Pons speechless. He recalled the interaction as strange, a finality of sorts, as if this was their last trip together. And it would be. It would be the last time they shared space together. It was the last time Sebastian Pons would see Lee alive. And of course, neither of them knew this. But the trip did leave Sebastian Pons concerned. Lee's mental state was something that scared him. So he kept calling Lee's assistants to express his concerns, as well as trying to get a hold of Lee himself. But everyone blew him off. Understandably, Sebastian Pons grew angry, saying he was Alexander McQueen, and all the people who surrounded him at work just wanted to please him. He would call a few more times, but he would never get through to Lee, and it frustrated him. He further went on to say, "I was just waiting for Lee to come home. I didn't respect the pretentiousness and shallowness of the fashion world and the front row. In that environment, everyone wants to be your friend, but there was no one actually looking out for Lee McQueen." And he was right. By midsummer 2009, Sebastian Pons was exhausted from doing everything he possibly could to get a hold of Lee, and so he expressed his concerns to Simon Unglis. It was also said that around this time, Sean Lean reached out to Simon Unglis as well to inform him that Lee's drug use had reached a tipping point. He was now suffering from drug-induced hallucinations that led to severe anxiety, paranoia, and severe depression. And this led Simon Unglis to panic. He tried pleading with Lee to move to San Francisco with him, but he couldn't get through to him either. Whenever he talked to Lee, he could never get him to talk about the things that mattered. Lee couldn't talk about what was going on in his life. He had bottled everything up. No one knew how depressed he was, how sick he was, or even how sick his mother was. But Simon Unglis remembers just how wounded and lost Lee sounded during this time. It was obvious that something was happening with him, but he just wouldn't open up. And Simon Unglis kept thinking if he could just get Lee to San Francisco, everything would be all right. They could finalize their plans, and Lee could get out of the industry. But Lee would never make it back to San Francisco.
I think there's more to life than fashion, and I don't want to be stuck in that bubble of this is what I do, because it's nice because you see everyone in the office, they go home and they can shut off. But I'm still like that Alexander McQueen after I shut the door. Do you know what I mean? I've got to go home with myself.
Yeah.
So, and, if you've had a bad day, you've only got myself to answer to. So.
Yeah, my life's always been a roller coaster. Up and down. Yeah, I still don't want to get off.
And all three men wondered why everyone just seemed to enable him. But at the same time, they all knew from personal experience that anyone who stood up to Alexander McQueen would face his wrath. Lee was extremely lonely. It was as though the sadness had eaten away at him, and he had hit rock bottom. He saw no way out. Despite his pain and personal issues, Lee still had obligations, and the thought of letting his team down ate at him as much as everything else. So he turned his focus to the only thing he could, which was work. And his next collection was something unlike anything out there. Inspired by a holiday trip he took to Thailand with Annabelle Nielsen, Lee dreamed up an entire collection of an oceanic underworld. With Annabelle Nielsen saying, "Sometimes we went to the Maldives or the Alps or to swim with the dolphins in Thailand." It was on one of those trips that we went deep sea diving, which Lee loved to do, where he found the inspiration for his last shows. With all those vibrant colors glowing like exotic fish at the bottom of an ocean, he saw another world deep within, one where he was at peace. One night during that trip, Annabelle Nielsen remembers going to bed, and when she woke up the next morning, she said, "We had adjoining rooms. I went in to have breakfast with him, but the room was empty. There were 12 pieces of paper on the table, all with the same simple sketch, almost like a tailor's dummy. But then I got to the last sheet, and there was the first dress from the Plato's Atlantis show, and it was perfect. It literally took my breath away. A tingle ran through my body. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. This was going to be one of his most amazing shows. I told him, 'My God, you've done it,' and he just smiled."
I have an infinity with the sea. I don't know, maybe because I'm Pisces.
Plato's Atlantis was a show inspired by nature and post-human movements depicted through sea and reptile prints. It was named after the city of Atlantis that sank into the sea, which Plato described as a utopian civilization created by founders who were half god and half human. As well, the show was inspired by Charles Darwin's theories on evolution and their connection with the current global warming crisis. Thus, the show was set in a future where humans were forced to evolve, from living on land to living in the water to survive. With Sarah Burton saying it was the idea of sort of the reversal of evolution, how life would evolve back into the water if the ice caps melted and we were being reclaimed by nature. We had all these engineered prints that he developed, sort of looking at the morphing of species, natural camouflages, and aerial views of the land. Lee even said this collection predicted a future in which the ice caps would melt, the water would rise, and life on Earth would have to evolve in order to live beneath the sea once more, or perish. Humanity would go back to the place from whence it came. So Lee had the team put their research on boards, and then he said, "I don't want to look at any research. Turn all the boards around." and then they focused on the fabrics, with Sarah Burton saying, so what he would do is he would have an engineered print, and with that print he would place it on the form, and he would pin and construct these pieces that looked like they'd morphed out of the body themselves. And only by taking the fabric and seeing how the fabric moved could you come up with something new, by creating it on the body, because clothes are meant to be worn. They're not two-dimensional things. They are something that has to sit and mold onto a human being. This show was a real trip for Lee, saying, there's no way back for me now. I'm going to take you on journeys you've never dreamed were possible. Though he would arguably do that throughout his career, Plato's Atlantis made the impossible possible. Because when the show did finally begin and the models came out, the core silhouettes were very strange. They are very odd. They are very difficult to describe, which is exactly what Lee wanted, telling his team during the creation of this collection, I don't want to look at any shapes. I don't want to reference anything, a picture, a drawing. I want it all to be new. And thus, this odd hourglass shape with rounded shoulders and a bell-shaped circle skirt was created. It was said to be an absolute technical feat. Lee had engineered the dress to fit a certain way, and with the patterns involved, it required that he cut a circle shape in the middle of the bolt of fabric, and it had to be exactly in the right place in order for it to work on the dress. The McQueen team said that Lee draped and cut more than 36 pieces, and barely made a single mistake, which is absolutely unreal. The result were these otherworldly dresses worn by models that look like molded hybrids of crustaceans with Elizabethan proportions. The color palette changed organically throughout the show from green and brown, which represented land, to blue and aqua to represent the ocean. It was the sophistication of the clothes, the intricacy of the work, and the ecological swell of the narrative that made the show so spellbinding. The press said he came alive when he was fitting clothes because he made you feel like you might as well pack your bags and go home. And while the clothes were memorable, it was actually the shoes that eclipsed everything. Alien, Titanic, and Armadillo. They were 12-inch heels that were inspired by the disfigurement of nature and human beings. The Titanic shipwreck boots were inspired by one of Lee and Annabelle's subterranean scuba explorations to a rusting hulk resting on the seabed, while the aliens were a 3D printed design inspired by the work of H.R. Geiger, who had worked on the special effects team for the movie Alien. But for obvious reasons, it was the armadillos that were the most controversial. All the models had to practice before the show to ensure that they wouldn't fall. And it was said that some models even backed out of the show because they didn't think they could make it down the runway without falling. However, it should be mentioned that no models tripped or fell during the show.
I was really scared. I tried not to picture myself falling. I wanted him to be proud of me, and I wanted him to be proud that he has such an army of models.
It was history in the making, a technical feat that took fashion somewhere it had never been before. Soon after, in December 2009, Lee's mother Joyce had to be hospitalized because of her health, and the entire family knew she didn't have long left. But they said Lee was too scared to visit, afraid to see her like that, and worried it would be the last time that he saw her alive. His sister Janet said he fought against it because he was frightened and didn't want to see her so ill.
Lee didn't really want to face the fact that we was going to lose Mum because he'd lost Izzy. He wasn't dealing with Mum not being well.
His family begged him to visit her, but he just couldn't. And like I said, no one outside the family knew how sick Joyce McQueen was, which made it even harder on Lee because from the outside at least, it looked like he had just given up, when in reality he was struggling to watch his mother die in front of his eyes. This period of reflection was coming to a close for Lee, and thus he began working on what would end up becoming the last collection he would ever work on. In January 2010, Lee would visit Robert Paulet, CEO of Kering, to express his concerns about the long-term sustainability of Alexander McQueen.
It's such an expensive thing to run this company. And McQueen's never been bankrupt, ever once. I want to be successful, I want to be self-sufficient. I can see McQueen lightly this a lot.
And Robert Paulet would reassure Lee that what they had built over the last few years had transformed the business into a brand that would live on forever, because it was real, it had integrity, and it was well managed. He told Lee he was proud of him and everything that he had achieved with Alexander McQueen. And Robert Paulet said Lee seemed to be relieved by the news, relieved to know Alexander McQueen would survive, that it would live on long after Lee was gone. He told Lee how proud of him he was and everything that he had achieved with Alexander McQueen. And he said that Lee seemed to be relieved by the news, relieved to know Alexander McQueen would survive, that it would live on long after Lee was gone. And while the news seemed to relieve him, his mother was still dying, and the grief was overwhelming. So he worked to stay busy, to keep his mind off things. And in order to keep going, he took drugs, so he didn't have to think about everything that was going wrong in his life. It was a full circle conundrum. Soon after this, Lee was persuaded to visit his mother, but it was said that he struggled immensely. His sister Janet said, I think he knew it was the last time he would see her. And he was right. And now this is just purely speculation on my part, but I think Lee knew he was going to die, whether by suicide or from the disease that was spreading throughout his body. In 2004, Lee would tell an interviewer that dying before his mother was one of his greatest fears because of how he felt about his life and how much pain his death would cause her. It's almost like he couldn't live without her, and she knew that. And this will all make more sense when you find out what Joyce McQueen's last words were to Lee before her death. And in the final conversation Susie Mankies would have with Lee that January, she recalled how Lee spoke about himself in the past tense, like he was already dead and gone. And maybe he was. By February 1st, 2010, Lee and Annabelle had gone out for the last time. They decided at the last minute to gatecrash a private dinner at Harry's bar to celebrate Tom Ford's directorial debut for his film A Single Man, with Annabelle Nielsen saying, "I thought it was a terrible idea, but I loved to laugh, and the thought of us being denied entrance to Harry's bar was too exciting, as all the good and fabulous had been invited, except us." So Lee dressed me up. He went in all beige, and I had a pink dress covered in diamonds and a fur coat with a hood. When belatedly offered a place at the table, we declined. Lee said we're not hungry. This was his last social engagement. Annabelle would later write that she thought Lee had gone to say goodbye. The pair had one drink, they took a photo, and they went home. The following day, February 2nd, Lee's mother, Joyce McQueen, passed away. And one of the final things she told Lee was, "You're not to go and kill yourself now." After the news spread, Philip Treacy went to visit Lee, where Lee confessed that he was having very dark thoughts and thoughts of killing himself. Understandably, Philip Treacy was upset. He was still reeling with grief from the loss of Isabella Blow, and he was holding on to Lee for support. He needed Lee, but Lee wasn't thinking about anyone else. He was completely surrounded by darkness. His mother, his rock, the woman who doted on him his entire life, who believed in him, who encouraged him, and who had come to every single show, was gone. And Lee didn't know how he was going to live without her, to live with the grief. The family planned Joyce McQueen's funeral service for February 12th, and during those final days, Lee just went through the motions. His siblings said that he didn't look like himself, and they were worried for him because he had idolized Joyce, and without her there, the safety he once found was gone. He must have felt utterly alone. His personal life was non-existent. He had no one to go home to, no one to share his life with, to tell about his day, to understand him. And yes, he wasn't alone. There was Philip Treacy, Sebastian Pons, Sean Lean, Simon Unglis, Annabelle Nielsen, Sarah Burton, his whole family, and so many others who loved him and were worried about him. But Lee couldn't see them. In his mind, he was alone. Lee told the press, "My life is like an Edgar Allan Poe story, living for the love of one's life, but sacrificing oneself for the love of work." On the days leading up to the service, Lee tried to collect himself. At least that's what it looked like from the outside. Sometime during this time, Lee called his ex-boyfriend Archie Reed, and he said, "A few days before he died, he called me, and I could tell that he had been taking drink and drugs." But Reed felt annoyed by Lee's self-centered attitude, calling him a selfish cunt, but it would be the last time he ever heard from Lee. On February 7th, he talked to his sister Janet and told her he loved her, which thinking back on she found strange, because Lee wasn't a demonstrative person. He then called Sean Lean and confessed to him that he didn't want to go to the cemetery to see his mother being buried, but Sean Lean reassured him that they would get through the service together, and that he wouldn't be alone. Lee then went to the studio to work with Sarah Burton, where he tweeted the following: "Been a fucking awful week, but my friends have been great. But now I have to somehow pull myself together and finish with the Hell's Angels and Prolific Demons." On February 8th, Lee spent the entire day with Annabelle Nielsen, where he gifted her his old wallet, telling her he was going to buy a new one, and he even gave her a picture of him and one of his beloved dogs. Then on February 9th, Lee called his sister Janet again, and based on that phone call, she believed he was coming to terms with their mother's death. He told her he was going to make her a nightgown for her final rest and would have it sent to the funeral parlor. Again, soon after, he went to the studio to work with Sarah Burton on their next collection that was going to be presented in 3 weeks' time. That night, Lee informed his team of his mother's service, and they all offered to take him to dinner after the service. Later that night, Lee went to a nightclub where an old friend saw him doing copious amounts of drugs and drinking exhaustively. They also noted that he was completely alone the entire time. And on Wednesday the 10th, Lee spent the entire day with Annabelle Nielsen. The pair spent the day planning their annual birthday trip. They then went to dinner with some of Lee's staff, to which many said Lee appeared to be very put together. And then the pair returned to Lee's house. She described him as blue, saying, "I spent the day before Lee's passing at his home. We spent every day together after Joyce died, and we're still planning a holiday for our birthdays after his show. He wanted to go kite surfing. All these flowers had come for his mother, but he hadn't read any of the cards, so he asked me to read them to him, and I did. And I read him some poems, and then I went home." She left Lee's house around 3 a.m. Thursday, February 11th. And after she left, Lee locked all of the doors and fastened the chains. He then took a concoction of coke, sleeping pills, and painkillers. It was said to have been enough to kill a person 3 times over. He then scribbled a note on the back of The Descent of Man by Wolf von Leikwitz, an excerpt which read, "Please look after my dogs. Sorry. I love you, Lee. P.S. Bury me in the church." He then researched various ways to die before making many attempts on his own that I won't be going into detail on. You can look it up if you feel so inclined. Only 6 hours after Annabelle Nielsen left, around 9 a.m., Lee's housekeeper arrived at the flat and had to break in through a utility room, which I'm guessing wasn't all that weird for him, because after breaking in, he just went about cleaning. It was only after he found a candle burning in one of the guest rooms, along with blood, that he grew concerned. So he went looking for Lee, and he found him hanging in his closet. Hysterical, he called paramedics, and then he called McQueen headquarters and told them, "He's done. He's gone for good." And everyone, and I mean everyone, made their way to Lee's house, hoping he was alive, just as he had been so many times before that. But this time was different, and they knew that. Some even said as they walked up, there was a part of them that just couldn't continue walking.
He used to say that a lot. One day, I'm gonna come home inside the body bag. And that day when the news opened again that day, him leaving his house inside a body bag.
Sean Lee described it as the saddest day of his life.
The fashion world is in shock tonight over the news that Alexander McQueen
Six. Alexander McQueen, the darling of British fashion, has been found dead after a
Alexander McQueen, 40 anni, è stato trovato morto, si dice impiccato nella propria
Вечная память торговой марки Александра Маккуина продолжит существование.
Lee Alexander McQueen was pronounced dead February 11, 2010. Just one day before the McQueen family was set to bury their mother, Joyce. Lee's brother remembered having to go home and explain to their father and the rest of the family that Lee was dead.
And then that phone call just changed everything.
Just like everyone else, the family was left utterly shocked by the news. They didn't know he was suffering from such psychological pain, and said that if they had known, they would have been pounding at his door. They were left truly heartbroken. I feel his head was turned by fame, but in the end he realized it was rather false, and not at all it was cracked up to be. He was longing for love, and when he lost the 2 people closest to him, Mom and Isabella, it was the final straw. And his sister Janet said, if we had known the extent of it, we would have been bashing down doors. But we didn't. We all spoke to Lee about the drugs. But he was a man in his late 30s. I don't want to name names. I've got to be careful. But people knew his state of mind, and his family didn't. They knew about the other suicide attempts. We didn't. His passing left a hole in the McQueen family, as well as the rest of the world. About Lee's passing, his brother Michael said, what baffled me was why someone who had so much would take his own life. Annabelle Nielsen said, I got a call from his private secretary the next day, when it was discovered what had happened. Lee was constantly fighting with his demons, but he had these highs and he had these lows. For a while our trips would be our escape. That phone call was the single lowest moment of my life. Lee promised me he would never do what Isabella had done, but who will ever know what was going on in his mind, what he was dealing with? His mother had just passed. His oldest dog Minter was dying of cancer, and he was running on an emotional deficit. What I never wanted to believe could happen did. No one will know how premeditated that night was. Sometimes I wonder if, even subconsciously, he knew what he was going to do. He gave me his wallet 2 days before, explaining he wanted a new one. He gave me a picture of himself with his dog, and he gave me all these other things, even though I said I didn't want them. He wrote some letters. He wrote of his dogs. I wonder now if things would have been different if I hadn't left that night. But a part of me knows that there is nothing anyone could have done to change anything. Lee made the choice he wanted. After Lee's passing, Annabelle Nielsen was photographed wearing a dress from Plato's Atlantis, along with the Titanic boots, while holding a crestle. And she spoke on this photo, saying, people who have been hurt are like birds. They flock together. We loved each other. I felt him before me, behind me, and at my side. I wanted to be photographed with a crestle because it was a bird he loved and admired. If I imagined him coming back as anything, it would be as a crestle. Kate Moss simply said, I loved him. Anna Wintour called it an insurmountable loss. Employees at McQueen removed everything from their storefront windows and placed an announcement about Lee's passing. His death felt like a larger cultural and generational loss. There were tributes throughout Fashion Week, and while many were left shocked, there were others who felt this was inevitable. His ex-boyfriend Archie Reed said, I got the impression that he was rushing towards death. And Tom Ford said, he came to dinner with me a few weeks before he died. He looked so sharp and fantastic. Of course I look at the picture that was taken of us together, and think I see a sadness in his eyes that I didn't notice at the time. But that is hindsight. That just goes to show anyone can be battling something dark, and you would never see it, because people show you what they want to show you. Further saying, if you had written him as a character in a novel, the end would almost inevitably have been the same. When Sebastian Pons heard the news, he flew straight to London to see Sarah Burton, and they discussed Lee's work. She showed him the unfinished collection that was about 80% complete, and together they decided the best way to honor Lee and his talents would be to present his final work to the public. Because unlike his last 3 shows that were confrontational, a plea against the excess of fashion, the plundering of Earth's resources, and the destruction of Earth by man, his final work, his unfinished work, looked at where we all go when it's all over. The 16-piece collection was shown March 8, 2010, to 7 groups of specially invited guests. The stage was simple, a solid backdrop with no theatrics, so every piece was allowed to stand alone. Overall, the show was a magical and religious collection that abandoned Lee's interest in destruction, industrialization, and the internet. His inspirations were 15th century sacred paintings of saints, angels, and Madonna with Child, from artists like Hugo van der Goes, Hans Memling, Jean Fouquet, Bosch, Botticelli, and Lochner. Annabelle Nielsen said his mood board was covered in pictures of purgatory, Dante's Inferno, and the work by the Chapman brothers. There was also a poem by Edgar Allan Poe that included both our names, which he found and loved. It's about a love so strong it reaches across the grave. We read it together a lot, me to him to me. It was one of those things we did together. Sarah Burton said he was looking at the art of the Dark Ages, but finding light and beauty in it. He was coming in every day, draping and cutting pieces on the stand. Lee wanted to see if he could replicate their glowing halo-like light in clothing, so they created digital prints based on the paintings that were then hand-loomed into silk jacquard. So while the models looked like medieval Madonnas, the show also looked back at some of Lee's past work, like Joan and Voss, with the models' heads wrapped tightly in bandages or donning mohawks. They wore digital prints of Bosch's The Last Judgment, The Garden of Earthly Delights, and The Temptation of St. Anthony, Stefan Lochner's 15th century altarpiece of the patron saint of Cologne, and the Portinari altarpiece by Hugo van der Goes. Burton said Lee was trying to get back to the handcrafting he loved and the things he felt were being lost in the making of commercial fashion. Though the collection was and is unresolved and unfinished, Lee began a collection that was poetically beautiful, that recaptured his past, but this time, instead of exuding aggression and anger, his work exuded grace and romance. It was almost like a direct reflection of what was going on inside his mind, knowing his mother was dying, he was getting sicker, that his dog was dying, and his interest in death had only increased. But instead of it being morbid, it was like Lee was finally looking towards the light. He once said, "Anger in my work reflected angst in my personal life. What people see is me coming to terms with what I was in life. It's always about the human psyche. My work is like a biography of my personality. I'm about what goes through people's minds, the stuff that people don't want to admit or face up to. The shows are about what's buried in people's psyches." This is probably why at the end of every presentation of this collection, the whispering words, "There is no more," fill the room. And it explains why the models didn't return for a final walkout, because this was the end. Hamish Bowles of Vogue said, "It was magisterial and a poignant ode to a career characterized by ceaseless invention, curiosity, and flashed of absolute brilliance." And it's clear to see his development, the references to his past work, like a high-collared cutaway jacket with gold feathers that was said to be inspired by his first Givenchy collection. It was said that many in the audience had a very difficult time watching the show, because it connected so deeply with Lee's obsession with the afterlife. And since he harnessed his dreams and demons into all of his shows, it wasn't surprising that his final work had been described as a battle between light and dark, to which it became officially and unofficially referred to as angels and demons. So after Lee's passing on February 25th, his family and close friends held a private funeral. Several members of the family went dressed in traditional Highland Scots tartan. Sean Lean was in attendance, and it was said that he laid the lock of Isabella Blow's hair that Lee wanted made into Victorian mourning rings into his casket. He also spoke at the funeral saying, "I watched you grow, you broke boundaries and succeeded." And he spoke of a trip he took right after Lee's passing, and how, in this moment of grief, he just looked up towards the night sky and asked, "Where are you, Lee?" And just as the words left his mouth, a shooting star shot across the night sky. Also at the funeral, Annabelle Nielsen read their favorite poem, a poem she said is about a love so strong that it reaches across the grave. It was Annabel Lee by Edgar Allan Poe, a poem about the death of a beautiful woman, and a love so strong that even the angels above were envious. It reads as follows. "It was many and many a year ago, in a kingdom by the sea, that a maiden there lived, whom you may know by the name of Annabel Lee. And this maiden she lived with no other thought than to love and be loved by me. I was a child, and she was a child, in this kingdom by the sea. But we loved with a love that was more than love. I and my Annabel Lee. with a love that the winged seraphs of heaven coveted her and me. And this was the reason that long ago, in this kingdom by the sea, a wind blew out of a cloud, chilling my beautiful Annabel Lee, so that her high-born kinsmen came and bore her away from me, to shut her up in a sepulchre in this kingdom by the sea. The angels not half so happy in heaven when envying her and me. Yes, that was the reason, as all men know, in this kingdom by the sea, that the wind came out of the cloud by night, chilling and killing my Annabel Lee. But our love, it was stronger by far than the love of those who were older than we, of many far wiser than we. And neither the angels in heaven above, nor the demons down under the sea, can ever dissever my soul from the soul of the beautiful Annabel Lee. For the moon never beams without bringing me dreams of the beautiful Annabel Lee. And the stars never rise, but I feel the bright eyes of the beautiful Annabel Lee. And so, all the night tide, I lie by the side of my darling, my life and my bride, in her sepulchre there by the sea, in her tomb by the sounding sea. Annabel and Lee loved this poem, with her saying, Lee and I both loved Edgar Allan Poe's poem Annabel Lee. I loved it because it was a tragic love story, even though he teased me that I liked it only because of its title. Even now he makes me laugh. Before he died, he had the entire poem embroidered in gold thread onto a giant piece of cloth for me, which I still have. It's the most important thing I own. After this service, Lee's ashes were laid to rest in Kilmore on the Isle of Skye in Scotland. Lee Alexander McQueen had returned home. In his will, Lee left money to various people, including his beloved dogs, but he also put a majority of his money into his charity, Saraband. And his family had actually suggested that the estate set up a scholarship fund for Central St. Martin students in need of assistance, as the only reason Lee ever was able to attend Central St. Martin's was because his aunt had come into some money and she loaned it to him. So the idea was really quite beautiful and sentimental, but that's not what the executors did at all. They kept the family completely in the dark and refused to disclose where any of the money went. And all the family wanted to know was why no awards or grants had been created in his name, when those were his final wishes. Lee's sister Janet said the executors may have behaved within the law, but in our view they haven't behaved with any compassion. We feel we have been treated like second-class citizens. They didn't let us see his house before it was dismantled, or pack up my brother's personal things, which is an essential part of the grieving process, and they are not keeping us informed about his legacy. I'm very sad that we have been excluded in this way. Lee was a very kind person, and he would have been horrified that this is happening to us. Like Janet said, the executors had packed up all of Lee's things, and they put them into a storage facility, and they wouldn't allow anyone access to it at all. The family wasn't given a sweater or even a photo of him. Everything was gone. And a year after his death, Janet had to hire a lawyer to force the executors to allow her access to Lee's personal effects. And in October 2011, she visited the storage unit where Lee's belongings were being kept, and she got to go through a small selection of boxes that the executors had deemed appropriate. And it was there that she broke down and cried. Combing through the boxes piled with artifacts of Lee's life, she found his clothes riddled with holes. On the experience, she said, I just got this horrible feeling in the pit of my stomach. I had been there on my own to get a little bit back of my brother, but I ended up feeling upset and alone. Even worse, the family was never given Lee's Commander of the Highest Order award, which he received from Queen Elizabeth, which is just disgusting. I understand working within the law to make sure people don't sell his possessions, but they weren't even preserving anything properly. Everything was discarded into boxes that no one could touch. And it's sad, especially because this was someone's brother, uncle, and friend who they lost quite tragically. Lee's brother Michael even said, I would like to know how you put a price on a medal. You can't buy one. You can't sell one. Surely the family could have it. And I agree. Alexander McQueen did not win that award. Lee did, and he accepted it on behalf of his mother. And then in September 2010, Annabelle Nielsen planned a public memorial for Alexander McQueen. She said the end of March used to be my favorite time of year. We would plan a vacation for both of our birthdays. I was born 2 weeks after him. This year, acknowledging his birthday without him has been especially difficult. I don't remember much of this time from last year. The days of his passing and his birthday and funeral, it was as if I was in a coma. There are a lot of emotions with death. Some people get angry, some people are sad, and some people are frustrated. But I think that Lee's memorial brought us all closer and brought us closure. The public memorial saw fans pressed up against barricades as they watched 12,000 mourners arrive for a service at St. Paul's Cathedral in London. The front steps became a catwalk for the fleet of black cars that came down the procession. Kate Moss stepped out in a black leather dress and tuxedo jacket. Naomi Campbell wore a black feather jacket with studded boots. Sarah Jessica Parker arrived in a fairy tale cream dress under a black coat. Daphne Guinness came in 12-inch platform black boots. And Anna Wintour came in a McQueen-designed floral embroidered black satin frock coat. Fashion's elite were all in attendance. Inside, an organist played and Bjork sang Gloomy Sundays by Billie Holiday while wearing a pair of giant wings that Lee had made for her. Philip Treacy and Lee's nephew led prayers and read passages from the Bible, and everyone spoke of his achievements. Susie Mankeys recalled the first time she met Lee, saying ankle-deep in cuts of fabric, turning his scissors savagely into the cloth he was cutting, and transformed it into fashion. The imagination and showmanship never drowned out his flawless tailoring, nor the subtle fluidity he learned during his period in haute couture. I had no doubt, and nor did he, that he wasn't an artist who just happened to work with clothing, and whose shows were extraordinary vaults of the imagination, and above all, that his work was deeply personal. Further stating, in thinking about the McQueen legacy, I remember his bravery, his daring, and his imagination, but I keep coming back to the beauty, the streamlined elegance of his tailoring, the wispy lightness of printed chiffon, the weirdness of animal and vegetable patterns that showed a designer who cared about the planet, not just planet fashion. She called him an artist who just happened to be working with clothing, a designer with an unparalleled vision of the future who was dragged down by his past. Anna Wintour said he was a complex and gifted young man who as a child liked nothing more than watching the birds from the roof of an East London tower block. He left us with an exceptional legacy, a talent that soared like the birds of his childhood above us all. There was no containing his contradictions. Even his final collection was a literal fight between light and dark. But he taught us that the runway was a place where dreams become reality. He harnessed his dreams and his demons. And while the fashion world mourned at that very public memorial, it was just that, for the public. That day, Lee's family sat apart from the celebrities and models, and I couldn't even find photographs of them walking into the church. His former boyfriend remarked how his family seemed uncomfortable, like they didn't understand Alexander McQueen's legacy, or just how much of an impact their little brother and son had on the industry. Lee's friend Alice Smith also noted this. She remembers focusing her grief on everyone's shoes, how the two sides of the church service were vastly different. She wasn't able to reconcile the family with the fashion crowd, saying I kept looking at their shoes. The family wore normal, high street, fashion shoes, and the other side fantastically expensive, ostentatious shoes. And now I only mention this because I think it perfectly describes the biggest paradox of Lee's life, one he could never resolve. His family was well-behaved, nice people, who worked and made just enough money to live and secure a good life for themselves. While on the other side of the coin was the wild Hollywood whirlwind where everyone was obsessed with themselves, people who spent thousands frivolously, who never worried about money or where their next meal was going to come from. Lee's friend Billy Boy said Lee had a kind of chip on his shoulder. He wanted to succeed and have privilege and money and fame that other people had, but also he resented them for having it. It was a paradox in his personality I don't think he resolved. I don't think he liked the background he came from and also resented it. And now, while I do agree with some of the things that Billy Boy says, I don't think Lee resented his background. I think it's that his background was always a constant presence and reminder of who he was. A reminder that he didn't belong in the fashion world, that he would never belong, and nothing he did would ever balance that out. It was the perfect juxtaposition between Lee Alexander McQueen, the friend, the brother, the uncle, the lover, and Alexander McQueen, the fashion designer. The service concluded with a lone bagpiper wearing McQueen tartan, leading the group out of the church where they gathered on the steps to hear 20 bagpipers play. The service itself felt like a McQueen show. Lee always said, I don't want to do shows where you walk out feeling like you just had Sunday lunch. I want you to come out feeling repulsed or exhilarated, as long as it's an emotion. If you leave without emotion, then I'm not doing my job properly.
Great and fitting tribute to the brother. Your mum would have loved her. She'd have been over the moon with her. She would have been over the moon with brother. What he done. I'm afraid no one was. It's very disappointing in that respect. So, his name lives on, they say.
Lee would have loved the theatrics, the raw human emotion, heritage, splendor and beauty of it all, but he would have been mad uncomfortable sitting through the accolades and eulogies as he was painstakingly shy and didn't believe the praise. He didn't like the limelight and only ever made the briefest appearances on stage before going home or to a private dinner. With a friend saying he certainly felt very pressured by his work, but it was a double-edged sword. He felt it was the only area of his life where he had felt he had achieved something. Usually after a show, he felt a huge come-down. He felt isolated. It gave him a huge low. He would have been amazed that he was held in such high esteem and loved by so many. And I know I've probably said this a lot already, but Lee always gets a bad rap in fashion for having been a loudmouth buffoon, a misogynist. But Tom Ford said that while Lee looked fierce on the outside, he was actually a marshmallow of a person. Adorable, charming, and kind. Lee Alexander McQueen was an enigma, l'enfant terrible and the hooligan of English fashion. Few could understand Britain's most accomplished designer, a sensitive visionary who reinvented fashion. He was named British Designer of the Year 4 times. International Designer of the Year, and Mayday Commander of the British Empire. But he was also just a human being who didn't know how to deal with fame. He once said, "I don't like to admit I'm a nice person, but I try to please everyone. I can't, but I try. I don't like standing out in a crowd. I clam up. I have panic attacks. What's the word when you can't take praise from anyone? Modest. Yes, I'm extremely modest." Though he was a well-regarded designer, Lee never forgot his East End roots and how much he owed it to his family. And this tug of war between the two worlds made Lee yearn for a place, a state, an idea, a man, a dress, a dream, a drug that could transform his reality. Addicted to the lure of fantasy and the idea that he might one day be free of his memories, his regrets, and his past. His shows combine the superficiality of fashion and the sublime beauty of it all. Despite the depression and sadness that overshadowed his life, Lee had an unstoppable energy. He built McQueen from the ground up with nothing. He inspired his team and an entire generation to create the impossible. Though his formal education was patchy, he was able to become creative director of Givenchy, proving you can be anyone and do anything. Even when the critics pointed out his flaws and prayed for his demise, he never stopped. He stayed to the best of his abilities, true to himself. Sadly, Lee never knew how much his work affected people, and how much people actually cared about him. There were many who were said to have felt betrayed and angered with Lee for leaving. Annabelle Nielsen said that he was the one and only person she would ever forgive anything for. His death was extremely hard on her. They were soulmates. She told the press, "He was my brother, my boyfriend, my soulmate. Most of the time people called me Mrs. McQueen. Quite often we were sharing a bed. The truth is I was happier with Lee than with anyone else. He asked me to marry him towards the end, and I said no. I wish now that I had said yes."
And I know he asked her to marry her. It must have been about 3 or 4 years before he died, I think. She actually has written in her notes, she said, I always rather regret that I didn't.
Even Lady Gaga, who only knew him a brief period of time, was heavily influenced by Lee and his work. His Plato's Atlantis show actually debuted Lady Gaga's single Bad Romance, and after his passing, she dedicated her 2010 Brits performance to him. She also owns 3 pair of the original Armadillo boots that never went into production, but even she felt his death, saying there is no diamond, no award, nothing I ever wanted more than a memory of my brief friendship with McQueen. I am sad every day that I enter my closet knowing he is not here anymore to dazzle the world with his beautiful, dark, limitless, brave mind. After a dream I had again about him, as the dream goes, I enter my closet and his clothes are no longer there. I'm tortured. The loss is deep. He was so talented. I hate the empty space. Not only in fashion, but in the creative consciousness that fizzled when he passed. I was reminded this morning that he is still here. He is everywhere, in every storefront window, in the designs of commercial mainstream retail, fashion, music, and the heart of every young designer that wished they could be as fearless as McQueen was. I cried all morning convinced he was with me, convinced that I'm loved from somewhere far beyond the eternal body and mind, outside all the chaos. I am here today not just because of my talent, but because he believed in me. My weird brand of art pop manic expression. My emotions, that was the part of me he knew. He taught me. I will be grateful long after I pass, and join him wherever they put souls like us. Long live McQueen.
Things I remember best is seeing him working. It was magical. For me, it was like a magician.
Nobody could create emotions in a show like Lee McQueen did.
Fashion for Lee was a way of just communicating a whole world, and he wanted to take himself out of the picture and just for people just to focus on this art that he's creating.
Raucous, bolshy, incredibly funny, incredibly driven. Not only did he have a singular vision, but he was a very singular individual. And his strength of personality was quite phenomenal. You just don't see many people like that. They don't come up very often.
And on May 2nd, 2011, on a beautiful Monday in May, the Met staged their annual gala celebrating the opening of Alexander McQueen, Savage Beauty. It was a retrospective dedicated solely to Alexander McQueen, a very rare occurrence that included over 100 pieces, beginning with his postgraduate work and through his last collection. It was such a success that the show was extended 2 extra weeks and people waited over 2 hours in line to get in. The Met even opened on Mondays when they were usually closed and stayed open until midnight to accommodate everyone. Now, if you got to see this, I'm incredibly jealous. I was too young to travel to see this, and it's one of my biggest regrets. But I did promise myself that if they ever bring this exhibit back, anywhere in the world, I will be going. I was also unable to go to the retrospective that the V&A did in 2015, which was an ironic homage to the English designer they had only turned their noses up to 2 decades prior. About the retrospectives, Annabelle Nielsen said, "Lee above all things was a great storyteller. He transported us all to different worlds with his narrative genius, which brought us willingly and passionately to admire his creations. I love the storyteller in Lee, the man and human being I miss. I could not have asked for a greater man to share my life with." The exhibits showed off his creativity, his cutting skills, and his dark romantic voice. How he could plan a collection in 2 days because his clothes were autobiographical and had a lot to do with his own sexuality and coming to terms with who he was. His shows exorcised his demons, healed childhood wounds, and expressed his thoughts on life. How he was able to inject the superficial world of fashion with dreams and illusions, and the deviant and depraved to empower women. The magnitude of his talent and his unquestionable gifts. But those things alone don't make Lee unique. What makes him unique is that even if you aren't into fashion, you can see the artistry and appreciate it. Claire Wilcox said with McQueen there was a sense of danger. You went to his shows and didn't know what to expect, and you felt you were witnessing the future. Katie England said, "Of course there is a dark side, but there is also a truly romantic side. Lee's such a romantic character, and he had these dreams. It's all about him looking for love. He could cut clothes flat or on a model, without thought. He was able to craft things that take people years of studying to even understand. He created complex couture-level work in hours. Once he had an idea, he was able to translate it in the form of clothing and theatrics. Every collection showed a moment of his life, a look into his soul. You can see collections where he struggled, where he was happy, where he was angry, where he was in love, where he tried to understand the balance between light and dark, and where he questioned life and death. His work lives on not because of its beauty, but because they are an extension of a person, which I find oddly poetic. So what happened to Alexander McQueen after Lee's death? Well, Kering had a lot riding on the house of McQueen, and upon Lee's passing, they needed to keep the image clean so that the house could remain profitable and respectable. They didn't want Lee's death to tarnish what they had built, meaning they didn't want anything to interfere with sales. So they did the only reasonable thing possible. In May 2010, they appointed Sarah Burton as creative director of McQueen, after having worked alongside him for over 14 years. She had a deep understanding of Lee's vision, which many felt would allow the company to stay true to its core values. From 2000 on, Sarah Burton was head of design, per Lee's request, and one of her duties was to take Lee's runway looks and translate them into more commercial work, as that was something Lee wanted no part of, and he trusted Sarah Burton completely with it. Karen Meningers, who was head of merchandising in 2007, called a meeting she had with Burton and Lee, in which she was requesting designs for pencil dresses. So Lee quickly drew up some sketches right there, and Sarah Burton got right to work redrawing them into exactly what he had envisioned. About the experience, Meningers said, "It was the first time I had witnessed the immense connection between Lee and Sarah. To me, it was a squiggle. To Sarah, it was a pencil dress. They had a connection written in the stars. He trusted her with everything, and in his last few years, he even talked of leaving everything to her. They were alike, 2 people who had an incredible gift, who didn't fit into the world of fashion. We know Lee never felt like he belonged, and Sarah Burton was no different, saying there have been times when if I could have disappeared from the industry, I would have. I had a battle with it. I don't look like a fashion person. I'm not cool. I'm shy. When celebrities tap me on the shoulder, I think they're asking me to move out of the way." I genuinely love this woman. She can do absolutely no wrong in my book. So who is Sarah Burton? Well, we talked about her in 1996, but we never talked about who she is. Sarah Burton grew up in a village in northwestern England and is the second of 5 children. She grew up making her own clothes, but never considered making a career out of it until an art teacher told her about Central St. Martin's. And it was there she became interested in learning everything she could, just like Lee. And it was through one of her teachers, Simon Unglis, that she was able to get an internship at McQueen. And the rest? Well, that's history. Lee's death turned Sarah Burton's world upside down. She knew how to build a narrative. She knew how to create a collection. But her biggest fears came from how to approach Lee's savage beauty, how to bring his darkest thoughts and persona into the work. With her saying, "The world that I grew up in was Lee. He was this person you just wanted to make happy. He was a genius, and when he died, I thought it was over." Then you think, can I do the job? Am I confident enough to think I can? Can there be creativity without the whirlwind he made? It made you question everything. And she feared failure. And she didn't realize the amount of courage it takes to simply say no, to do what she believed McQueen should represent over what everyone else was telling her, saying Lee knew exactly what he wanted, and he would never allow himself to think anyone's opinion was more important than his own, and that's something she had to learn for herself. saying, "When Lee died, I realized that he was a conductor of an orchestra. It was this orchestra of a lot of different types of personalities, not just people in the studio, but outside people as well. That was my biggest struggle, learning to say, this is what I want, and you all have to listen to me." Further saying, "Lee is Marilyn Monroe, he's James Dean, and to be honest, it's taken me a while to stop being afraid and see that the company needs me to be at my best." She needed to stand by her work, just like Lee always told her to do, and she proved she was more than capable. But she also knew the expectations of her first few shows were going to be pretty low. Lee's legacy was a tough act to follow, and Sarah Burton's work was going to be subjected to heavy scrutiny. In fact, according to writer Andrew O'Hagan, another label reached out to Sarah Burton after Lee's suicide and warned her that she would always be haunted there. However, over time, she would come to define a legacy all her own, looking for inspiration in the healing power of nature and the rural English tradition she grew up with. Whereas Lee used history and inner demons to create his own dystopian world, Sarah Burton used these themes and materials to celebrate her own passion for tradition and craftsmanship. Because it's not like Lee left behind a rule book. With Sarah Burton saying, "I think with Plato's Atlantis, it was real perfection the way he executed every single piece." But knowing Lee, he probably would have gone somewhere completely different after Angels and Demons. He would always surprise you, and that was the joy of working with him, is he would always take it somewhere that was unexpected. Every time he would take up a different theme, or a different angle, or a different technique, and he would always push it forward, like relentlessly pushing forward. And you could never really predict what he was going to do, because he was so much his own person. His vision was so pure, and he was really funny, and he was really good fun to work with. And you know, he was incredibly loyal and incredibly inspiring. And while tensions were heavy, Sarah Burton's collection was anything but. That spring 2011 collection respected Lee's fierce aesthetic, but she softened it with a feminine touch, telling the public there would always be what she called McQueen elements, but she had to stay true to herself, because that's what Lee always drummed into her. With Sarah Burton saying, "You have to be able to stand behind your work," and she did just that.
She was famous for doing really structured shoulders, but instead of stuffing them, she cut them, so the fabric waved on its own.
The thing that Lee was about and McQueen is about is telling a story. They start off quite clean and people have lost their own identities. So each piece was so individual and the embroidery started to grow onto the body, like the bullion on the frock coat. And then it all started to peel away and the shoes became the flowers. So it's like she was being taken back by nature, really.
The show was whimsical, full of natural elements like basket-woven hairstyles and butterflies, breastplates of gilded cornstalks, and skirts of pheasant feathers. The work was otherworldly yet tender, and it's no wonder it was featured in the Hunger Games. She showed the public that she knew what she was doing, and McQueen would live on in good hands. But Sarah Burton still reminisced about her time working under Lee, remembering how on her first day in the Huxton Square studio, she watched as Lee took lace and pinned a beautiful dress on the stand in an hour. Utterly fascinated and awestruck by how he would dance around the mannequin like it was a sculpture, how he used to color code his pins, painting the end the same color as the fabric so as to not impede the visual impact of the work in progress. Through Lee, Sarah Burton learned not only strict English tailoring, but also his risks, and she used the simplicity and complexity of his work on her own, telling the press a lot of clothes today look like they haven't been touched by a human hand, so they don't fit properly. And I think it's really important that clothes are made for a woman's body. For me, it's not just about a show or a review, it's about dressing women and how a piece makes them feel. As soon as you put a McQueen jacket on, you stand differently because it has a waist and it has a shoulder and it makes you feel empowered. It's great if you can do that for women. And she took it a step further after the announcement of Prince William's engagement to Kate Middleton in 2011. Almost immediately, the world wondered who would design her dress, the importance of which can't be understated, considering Princess Diana's gown became one of the most famous dresses in modern history. Kate Middleton's dress was going to be seen by an estimated 2 billion people, so she went to a British Vogue editor for advice, and they urged her to hire Sarah Burton of Alexander McQueen, which she did, and they kept the secret between them. None of the employees at McQueen even knew they were working on the royal wedding dress. They thought it was for a movie or the theater, but it wasn't until Kate Middleton stepped out of her Rolls Royce in front of Westminster Abbey in a beautiful McQueen gown that anyone knew, and a huge sigh of relief was felt throughout the world, because not only did she choose the house of a British fashion designer, but one many began to consider as the house of one of the greatest British couturiers. And now for some much needed lightness and fun, we're going to talk about some of Sarah Burton's collections. Her fall 2012 collection returned to the pod silhouette from Plato's Atlantis, and while everything was so technically made, they looked light as a feather. That collection to me felt like a rendition of Lee Scanner's collection. Her fall 2013 collection touched on one of Lee's favorite topics, religion, evoking humility and the purity of Anglicanism, as well as the extravagance and excessiveness of Catholicism. The intimate 10-piece collection was broken up into 5 subgroups: communion, nuns, cardinals, popes, and angels. It exuded heavenly bodies. In Sarah Burton's Spring 2017 collection, she took her team to Scotland's Shetland Islands, where they found inspiration in Fair Isle sweaters, balls of wool, shawls knitted of the finest lace, and hand-loomed tweeds. The collection was filled with vivid memories of Nordic wind-slashed landscapes, of islanders whose craft revealed the pride of what they do. Sarah Burton and her team, famous for their research trips, looked for inspiration the same way Lee found his. In her Spring 2020 collection, it was a celebration of group activity and finding nirvana through craft, which included beaded linen in black and white. The Victorian dresses may not seem as elaborate as the raw-edged tulle corsetry and embellished gowns that were a known part of the McQueen house, but they are crucial to the legacy. The entire show was about slowing things down, timeless work, stripping back to the basics, which led the team to linen, a sustainable cloth and the noble fabric of Ireland. The McQueen team actually traveled to Malin Farms to learn how linen was grown, harvested, spun, woven, and laid out in the field to sit under the sun. The team listened to the magical story of the linen getting bleached by the moon. They visited the William Clark Mill, the last commercial linen beetle in the world that helped produce pieces for the collection. Her Fall 2021 collection symbolized a time of healing, which is why the collection was based around anemones, a flower that symbolizes protection and relaxation. According to Greek mythology, an anemone sprang from Aphrodite's tears as she mourned the death of her love, the flower that is brought to bring luck and protection against evil, especially during a time where there is a lot of uncertainty in our lives. Some even say the flower refers to the beginning of spring, to the circle of life and love. The anemones printed on the piece were done by crushing up photographs of flowers, photographing the crushed up images, and transferring them onto the fabric. The entire collection was trailing water lilies and anemones against Victorian eyelet lacing. It was again a look at how Sarah Burton kept Lee alive with her McQueen collections. And sadly, in what would become some of her final collections for Alexander McQueen, it's hard not to feel as though maybe Sarah Burton knew her time there was coming to a close, because every collection seemed to reference her past, Lee's past, and the legacy they would both leave behind at Alexander McQueen. During lockdown, Sarah Burton had time to reflect, and she mostly reflected on her early years at McQueen, saying, "It made you question what you were doing. Why do you need 60 versions of that? Let's just do the things we really believe in." By spring 2023, Sarah Burton focused on the eyes, saying the eye is the most unique symbol of humanity. Each one is like a fingerprint. Each one is completely individual. It's sort of about seeing things again, not walking around with your eyes shut or your eyes down. Eyes see everything. It can also open you up to the horrors of the world. After rereading George Orwell's 1984 dystopian novel about the effects of an authoritarian government that manipulates its citizens to believe anything they want them to believe, Sarah Burton was inspired. She said that played into it. How do you find human connection in the world we live in the world of technology? She was also inspired by Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delights, which looked at the sins of temptation, nature surrounded by sin, and demons battling angels. It was Sarah Burton's first connection back to the last McQueen collection ever created between her and Lee, angels and demons. All of this led her back to the main themes of Lee's legacy: nature, technology, history, and the fear of the present. With Sarah Burton saying this collection is about searching for humanity and human connection. It's the times we're living in now. It feels almost like we're living in another dark ages in many ways. It's something we've always looked at McQueen. Life, death, destruction, beauty. It's all there. Maybe it's what people do to each other actually, and then the beauty right next to it. So there's this strange juxtaposition of humanity behaving in one way and nature in another. And that led Burton to question how this would change the proportion of a woman's body, how to dress a woman to empower them in the times that we live in. While her fall 2023 collection seemed dark, because nothing was as it seemed. Inspired like Lee by the body, by human anatomy, Sarah Burton told the press, "It was looking at anatomy, the anatomy of tailoring, almost back to the beginnings of McQueen on Savile Row. It was a progression, which starts very kind of straight and structured, and then it begins to flash and twist and turn upside down. It's like how you begin with a garment. You have to know that there's a way to construct it, the bones of it, before you can dissect it and subvert it, which is why everything about the show was turned around and upside down, like a pinstripe suit that was inspired by Cate Blanchett in Tar, where the chalk marks were visible on the clothes, and a stop-motion Victorian photography film that played upside down on the walls, almost like it was symbolizing how upside down everything in the world is." Sarah Burton wanted to expose us, to expose our bodies, to peel back and dissect, which is what led her to be heavily inspired by Da Vinci's anatomical drawings. So the incised hips and peeled back clothes gave subliminal messages to dissected cadavers in the form of blood and guts. She told the press, "Human anatomy, the anatomy of clothing, the anatomy of flowers, an exploration of beauty and power through tailoring. Garments are dissected, slashed, sliced, and twisted. Shoulders are strong, waists are narrowed, heeled trousers elongate the leg. The bumpster's in reverse. The most prominent motif in the collection is the orchid, in its rare forms cultivated, but after the daisy, the most common flower. It thrives in air, resists being rooted, and grows in the wild. Extraordinarily beautiful and infinitely adaptable, the orchid mimics both predator and prey. In the language of flowers, the orchid is a symbol of love." It's love of women, love of life, love in its purest form. Because McQueen under Lee and Sarah Burton was always about the love of women. But this show was more than just about love. It was about exposing the truth, of seeing what lies within us. Which is probably why Sarah Burton referenced Lee's Joan collection so much. Like a shredded black bugle bee dress that was a reincarnation of Lee's Joan woman. It was a fitting nod to a legendary collection, and Sarah Burton topped it all off by playing the original soundtrack from Joan, played backwards. And then in what would be her final collection at Alexander McQueen, in spring 2024, Sarah Burton looked at all things woman. A collection that summed up 26 years at the house of Alexander McQueen. A salute to the house's beginnings, with Sarah Burton saying this collection is inspired by female anatomy, Queen Elizabeth I, the Blood Red Rose, and Magdalena Abekanowitz, a transgressive and powerful artist who refused to ever compromise her vision. The show is dedicated to Lee Alexander McQueen, whose wish was always to empower women, and to the passion, talent, and loyalty of my team. The Red Rose was a nod to England, while Abekanowitz suggested that Burton was embracing womanhood, comfort, and protection, her legacy to the House of McQueen. And while Lee's work was haunting and violent, Sarah Burton's work almost looked like an artifact, a celebration of the female body. It was an emotionally charged show. The set was an infinity symbol that feels like Sarah Burton's way of saying she will live on, that Lee will live on, and that their legacies will forever be a part of the House of McQueen. At least that's what I think. And I think it's fitting that David Bowie's Heroes was the song to close the show, a song to mark Sarah Burton's final bow to Alexander McQueen. And it felt like the right note to end on because Alexander McQueen was never about one singular person. Alexander McQueen was created through the work of the McQueen team, through Sarah Burton's team, through the hands of Simon Unglis, Simon Costin, Sebastian Pons, Katie England, and Sarah Burton, who all influenced and had a hand in the creation and legacy of Alexander McQueen. Alexander McQueen was a team. Alexander McQueen was for all women, a suit of armor against the world. Outside of the work, Sarah Burton did a lot for the house. She was more than just a fashion designer. She pushed the house in new directions, just like Lee would have wanted. She donated fabrics to over 20 institutions and fashion community projects throughout the UK. And she set it up because it's incredibly hard to source fabrics today. And it was hard as well when she was trying to find fabrics for her own graduation collection from Central St. Martin's. And she actually said that Lee helped her source the fabrics for her graduation collection, and she wanted to do that for others. And this idea of no waste is a huge part of the McQueen DNA, as not once in the 14 years Sarah Burton worked with Lee did she ever see a single bolt of fabric being thrown away. Sarah Burton solidified herself as a fashion designer, a trailblazer, an icon, a legend in her own right. She paved her own path through the shadow of Lee's legacy. And towards the end of her time at McQueen, Sarah Burton went back to the archives, and yet she still wanted to give people something new, to create new beginnings, convinced this was the only way forward for her at McQueen, for everything to be slower, for the collections to be smaller. And ultimately, I think that's why she left Kering, why she left Alexander McQueen, because Kering would never allow this to happen. In fact, Kering was looking to expand the House of McQueen. They had just hired a new CEO who, like many others, was under great pressure to make changes that sparked growth and profits. With Kering saying, it's a brand that has been built already to a very significant size by the success of ready-to-wear, and based on that we have room to develop other categories that are still underdeveloped. If you put that together in a very smooth way without pushing too much, the brand will grow. When you're a ready-to-wear brand at that scale, with such consistency and style over time, without disruption for more than 10 years, that's a huge asset. But again, it's always about money and growth, and it makes me sad and sick to my stomach because nothing is enough. Not even the $800 million in sales that Sarah Burton brought into Alexander McQueen. It didn't matter that most of their sales came from ready-to-wear, which is extremely rare in the fashion world. Most houses like Gucci and Louis Vuitton make their money from accessories, and Alexander McQueen was the opposite under Sarah Burton. And they went and ruined that by being greedy. Kering and LVMH, two of the world's biggest fashion conglomerates, have been struggling to keep sales and profits high, but Kering has been hit the hardest. They got rid of Alessandro Michele at Gucci. Then there's the Balenciaga Demna debacle that I still can't wrap my head around. And then Sarah Burton at Alexander McQueen. By getting rid of two of their biggest assets and keeping a giant liability, Kering has taken many major missteps. In September 2023, it was announced that Sarah Burton would be stepping down from the House of Alexander McQueen. After 26 years, she was leaving, having started in 1996 as an intern to taking the helm in 2010 after Lee's passing. Sarah Burton was and always will be the House of McQueen. In a statement, she said, "I am so proud of everything I've done and of my incredible team at Alexander McQueen. They are my family, and this has been my home for the past 26 years. I want to thank Francois-Henri Pinault for believing in me and offering me this amazing opportunity. Above all, I want to thank Lee Alexander McQueen. He taught me so much, and I am eternally grateful to him. I am looking forward to the future and my next chapter, and will always carry this treasured time with me." Kering released the following statement: "We would like to express our immense gratitude to Sarah for writing such an important chapter in the history of the Alexander McQueen house. Sarah's contribution over the last 26 years will leave an indelible mark." And as sweet as this all seems, when I heard the news, I was in complete disbelief. I couldn't help but think that this wasn't Sarah Burton's decision, and I was glad to find out I wasn't the only person who felt this way. Kathy Horn, the fashion critic, wrote an article for The Cut in which she wrote, "When I saw Pinault in Milan 10 days ago, I asked him if the decision had been hers. He said it was, and that she told him she felt she was becoming creatively stale. That's possible, of course. 26 years at one house is a long time, but to me it didn't sound like something Burton would say. Across the industry, designers and brands are under pressure to increase sales, and there are only so many ways you can do that without compromising who you are. Sarah Burton may have simply said no for the last time, and I absolutely believe this." And like I said before, their focus was on accessories, and Sarah Burton's was always about the clothes. Just like Lee, she cared more about the work than anything else, and that is why it hurts so much. And now you may be wondering what Sarah Burton is doing today. Well, she took over the creative director role at Givenchy. Yes, I said that correctly. I didn't stutter. She took over Givenchy. She told the press, "It's a great honor to be joining the beautiful house of Givenchy. It is a jewel. I am so excited to be able to write the next chapter in the story of this iconic house, and to bring Givenchy my own vision, sensibility, and beliefs." And it's something. I mean, we all know how Lee was treated at Givenchy. We all know about his time there. And that's why I say something had to go down between her and Kering, because she could have taken a break. You know, she could have gone anywhere. And instead, she went to Givenchy, a house owned by LVMH, Kering's biggest rival, a house that Lee was once a part of. And I'm not saying she's following in his footsteps or anything like that. Sarah Burton absolutely paved her own legacy that is all her own. But I definitely think there's something there. And while Lee absolutely hated Givenchy and LVMH with his entire being, I think he would have been proud of her. Like many others, her departure left me so sad and heartbroken. The only reason anyone believed in Alexander McQueen was because of Sarah Burton, who loved, cherished, and respected the House of McQueen. She was the only person who should have taken over the house after Lee's passing. And honestly, she should have been the last. Alexander McQueen is losing its magic to overpriced accessories that don't speak to the brand and their identity. And I want to leave you with something.
I think if I ever get that old and I'm still around and I leave my company, I just burn the place down.
Yeah.
There's no one to work there.
Really? So you'd never let someone carry on the McQueen tradition or the McQueen brand if you weren't actively involved?
I don't think so.
Oh.
I mean, it does. Because that person will have to come up with the concepts for my show. My shows are so personal. How can that be? I mean, and then unless it turns into an awful runway of non-existenceness,
That's a concept. I don't.
Who's going to come and see that?
Now, years after this, Lee would tell friends that he would only be willing to relinquish control of the house to Sarah Burton, who he trusted completely. And again, honestly, she's the only person who could have succeeded him. She knew his work through and through, what he stood for, what Alexander McQueen meant, and she had already been taking the lead for some time. Alexander McQueen meant more to Sarah Burton than anyone else. Because Simon Unglis said, she's way more protective of the brand than Lee ever was. She's the guardian and safekeeper of that whole thing, and I don't think Lee would have been that way. And again, this is why I ultimately believe something had to happen between her and Kering for her to leave Alexander McQueen, because I just don't see any other reason why she would leave. After Sarah Burton's departure, it was announced in December 2023 that Irish national Sean McGirr was going to be taking over the House of McQueen. A graduate of Central St. Martin's who studied under Louise Wilson, following the same path as Lee and many others, his announcement was obviously met with a lot of speculation, because many felt the House of McQueen should just close down, but Kering would never allow that. And honestly, a part of me wanted to see Alexander McQueen live on for all people who find solace in art and fashion, who visit their trauma, who question their identity, and explore their fantasies through art. But there's an even bigger part of me that thinks it should just close, because it doesn't matter who Kering hires. They are always going to be looked at under a microscope, and I'm sure Sean McGirr is under immense pressure to not only live up to the legacy left behind by McQueen and Sarah Burton, but to put out commercial work. And while Sean McGirr has stuck close to reinterpreting Lee's old work, if that's ultimately what you want to call it, his first few collections were pretty lackluster. In his first collection, Fall 2024, Sean McGirr was heavily inspired by Lee's Spring 1995 collection, The Birds. About the collection, he said, it should have a sort of playful aggression to it, and should be kind of uplifting, because I want to bring a kind of lightness to McQueen. However, despite the inference to The Birds, McGirr mentioned that he hadn't even had time to look into the archives, and more so looked at photos. And just like Lee, Sean McGirr focused on taking inspiration from his own childhood in Ireland. The horse themes throughout the show were a reference to the horse-keeping travelers of his hometown. The fragmented, shattered crystals were inspired by smashed phone screens. And the molded steel dresses in Lamborghini yellow and Aston Martin blue wove into the McQueen legacy Sean McGirr's own life. He told the press, "My dad is a mechanic, and I grew up talking about cars with him. It's our weird connection as designers, I suppose." And while Lee McQueen looked to create a coat of arms for women, Sean McGirr's McQueen woman and man are slightly different, telling the press it's a man or woman who are hedonistic characters. In a way, it was like these sort of people who modeled for McQueen in the 90s. They kind of looked like people on the fringes, outsiders. I'm really interested in that. So I guess it's about singular characters with really strong personalities that I'd be very curious to meet on the streets in London. This sort of rough glamour of the East End, this idea of sort of damaged opulence. And I also like this kind of bitchy intelligence that kind of comes through a little bit in the attitude of the boys and girls. And in his second collection, Spring 2025, even though Sean McGirr finally had a chance to look through the archives, he chose instead to focus in on Lee's sketches, specifically those from his Banshee collection, while also inferring his own Celtic heritage and the stories his mother told him as a child. He played on the S-bend curve and bumpsters, saying his signature was really the S-bend, so I was thinking of a way to interpret it, which led him to create the rolled lapel silhouette, and the bumpsters, which led him to create trousers with sneaky, cheeky little cutouts, that I personally wouldn't call bumpsters, but I can let that go, I guess. And I really do hate to be so critical of him because he is in a tough spot. But it doesn't seem like Sean McGirr is actually feeling the heat. He told the press he wasn't intimidated by the legacy Lee and Sarah Burton had left behind, instead saying, "I don't see it like that. I was just pumped to get going." And I feel like that has to be a lie. How can anyone not be intimidated? And it makes me wonder how sales are going because everything seems to be lacking, from the tailoring to the elegance that Lee and Sarah Burton were so strict about. A talent that was embedded in their bones, as well as the DNA of the house. And it's not so much a problem with any one thing in his work, but his last collection that he just showed the other day, it's probably going to be a few weeks by the time this video comes out, it was beautiful. It really was. And yet there's something I just can't quite put my finger on that doesn't feel authentic. It's almost like the work is too safe. Like there's no element of savagery. There's no love of women. I'm going to take that back a little bit. I actually think it was only with this last collection that I felt like Sean McGirr was starting to understand who the McQueen woman actually is, because it finally looked like he wanted to make women look beautiful and strong. But there's still something I'm not enjoying, and I think many people feel the same way. It does feel like McQueen is struggling to keep their heads above water, the same way Gucci is. Like clockwork, this happens every few years for a fashion house of this caliber. It happened to Gucci after Tom Ford was fired. It lulled under Frida. And then Alessandro Michele brought new life into it. And then executives wanted a change to take back control and take the house of Gucci in a new direction. And actually, rumors have been going around all day today that Demna Balenciaga might be taking over the house of Gucci. Which I really hope are not true. I really hope. I swear Demna has to have something on Kering. With the way they won't let him go, no matter what. It's like, no press is bad press for him. He is their version of John Galliano at LVMH. He can do no wrong. Anyway, back to Sean McGirr. It's incredibly unfair to ask someone new to come in to keep momentum up and sales up while also fully changing the direction of a house. And it's incredibly unfair to these designers as well, who really kind of take the brunt of this. We already know how Givenchy treated Lee, the position that they put him in, the pressures that they put on him, as well as the mental toll that it took on him. And yet they continue to get away with it. But Lee was different. He didn't go silently, and I appreciate that. As people who love fashion, all we want is the truth. You know, give us some honesty. That's all we're looking for. Show us something that has meaning. Show us something with raw beauty. Show us something that's real. Okay, so I think this might be where we leave each other. Please, 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 as always, let me know what you thought of this video, as well as this series as a whole. If there's anything that you didn't like. Also, feel free to check out the link in my description for all the sources that I've used. There are plenty of videos out there that go in depth on these collections. I highly recommend you look into them if you're interested. If not, totally cool, just a suggestion. But yeah, that seems to be it. I hope you enjoyed these videos as much as I've had making them. I'm feeling a little sad right now. I've worked incredibly hard on this and I just really don't want it to end, but it has to. Oh, also, I've been on YouTube for a little over a year now. I only realized when I was posting part 3, so I wrote like a little thank you in the description. I don't know if anyone saw it, but I just wanted to verbally thank everyone for the hours watched, the comments, the likes, the follows, the positivity and absolute love all around. It means the absolute most to me. I work 2 jobs and I do this in my free time, so these videos are purely made out of love. There's no money involved. I don't monetize these videos. Not that that matters. Also, I have some fun video ideas planned for the future. I'm not sure how they're going to go over, but we'll see. I also want to get back on TikTok. I don't know how I'm going to do that. I don't think it's going to be like the same as this. Maybe it'll be me trying to like sell all the clothes that I need to get rid of. I'm surrounded by clothes. And I've also lost the plot. Okay, I need to come back around. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And please let me know what you think in the comments. And as always, I will see you for the next one. Probably in like the next month or so, but we're absolutely going to be seeing each other again soon, I promise. I'm Lolly, and I hope you have a beautiful rest of your day or night. Bye.
People don't take young English yobs lightly in Paris.
That whole celebrity thing and people chasing after him, because you got the feeling he was saying, this is not the important thing. This fame is nonsense. You know, what the important thing is what I do.
Sometimes wish he just had a normal life and that he could just be a normal person in terms of not having that pressure of everything at such a young age.
Working with Lee for 17 years and knowing him that long, when he passed, obviously, as you know, one of his closest friends, I was devastated. But the energy that we embraced together when we worked, and through our friendship, but when we worked, that never left me.
Always trying to back myself and coming up with, looking for that pinnacle of my life.
And I have an infinity with the sea. I need to, I don't know, maybe because I'm Pisces, I don't know. It's just that it's very calming, you know, it's all the elements.
I seem sad at times about my work and my life. It's sad, but I'm not bitter because I'm grateful for everything that's happened in my life. But I know when the time is to give it up.